Have you ever wondered what our world would look like if farming just never happened? It's a really simple question, right? But the answer changes pretty much everything we think we know about ourselves. So today, we're going to explore that alternate path, a human history without its single biggest invention.
No, seriously, take a second and actually picture it. A world where that one light bulb moment, that one discovery, just never goes off.
So right off the bat, all of this is gone. No fields of wheat, no herds of cattle. The entire foundation of how we feed ourselves, it's just not there.
And when that foundation disappears, well, everything we built on top of it starts to crumble. You can say goodbye to huge cities, to countries, to borders, all the massive societies we just take for granted.
So what are we left with? A planet of almost 8 billion people, all living the way our ancient ancestors did? Foraging? Hunting? Forever? Would that be some kind of natural paradise, or would it be something totally different? All right, so to really wrap our heads around a world without agriculture, we've first got to get on the same page about the story we're always told with it. You know, the standard story of how we became us.
And yep, there it is. This is the classic step-by-step flowchart you probably learned in history class, right? First comes farming, which gives us extra food. That lets us stop wandering and settle down. Then populations explode, and since not everybody needs to find food anymore, you get craftspeople, scientists, leaders, and boom, you've got civilization. It seems so neat, so tidy, almost like it was the only way things could have happened.
Now that neat little story paints a really specific picture of what life was like before farming. You know, this simpler, kind of primitive way of life that we were destined to leave behind.
But here's the thing. What if that whole story, the one that draws a clear line between civilized farmers and primitive hunter-gatherers, is just wrong? Because a whole lot of new evidence is suggesting that it might be.
This is the myth. It's the picture we all have in our heads, right? Our ancient relatives, living in these tiny, nomadic groups of maybe a few dozen people. Everybody's equal, there are no bosses, no wars, they just share everything. It's a really nice, almost romantic idea of humanity in its natural state.
Okay, so now for the fun part. Let's look at what actual archaeology and anthropology are telling us, because the reality is so much messier and honestly way more interesting. We're going to take that myth apart piece by piece.
And the key to this whole new picture is this one idea: complex hunter-gatherers. These were groups of people who proved you didn't need to plant a single thing to build a big, complicated society that stayed in one place and had real hierarchies.
For example, let me introduce you to the Calusa Kingdom in southern Florida. These guys absolutely shatter that myth of small nomadic bands. This was a full-on kingdom of hunter-gatherers. They had a king who inherited his power, a military, a whole class of priests, and they controlled dozens of villages. They even built these massive canals and huge buildings, one that could hold 2,000 people. And they did it all without farming a thing, because they were powered by one incredibly abundant resource: fish. And so much for that idea that everyone was equal. Just listen to this. It's about a burial in Italy that's over 23,000 years old. They found a teenage boy buried with this incredible cap made of shells and deer teeth, holding a giant flint knife, with all sorts of mammoth ivory objects. You just don't bury an equal like that. The archaeologists who found him nicknamed him the Prince. So yeah, it looks like we had royalty tens of thousands of years before we had farms.
So what about that last part of the myth? You know, the peaceful, harmonious existence? Well, the evidence paints a much, much darker picture.
Just look at this. It's a mass grave from a hunter-gatherer site in California. 4 young men, all thrown in together. And 2 of them still have arrowheads and spear points stuck in their bones. This isn't peaceful. This is clear as day evidence of warfare. And believe me, this isn't a one-off find. Sites like this all over the world tell us that organized violence has been with us for a very, very long time.
Okay, so if farming wasn't the magic light switch that suddenly created complex societies, then what was the real limiting factor? What was the true bottleneck holding humanity back? Well, the answer isn't in our tools, it's in basic biology. It all comes down to a concept called trophic inefficiency. Now I know, that sounds really technical, but the idea is actually super simple. Basically, every time you go up a step in the food chain, you lose a ton of energy. A cow eats grass, but only gets a tiny fraction of the grass's energy. Then, if we eat the cow, we only get a tiny fraction of that energy.
So let's look at our two lifestyles. If you're a gatherer, you're eating plants. You're getting your energy straight from the source. It's incredibly efficient. But if you're a hunter, you're one step removed. You're eating an animal that has already burned off most of the energy it got from plants. And in places with long winters where you have to rely on hunting, that inefficiency puts a really hard limit on how many people can survive in one area.
And if you want to see just how big a difference this makes, check out this number. A scientific model found that a society living only on plants could support 9.5 times more people in the same area as a society living only on meat. That is a massive difference. It just goes to show you how powerful these basic laws of nature are in shaping our story.
So, what does this all mean for our big what-if question? Well, it means a world without farming would not have been a simple, uniform planet of small, wandering bands.
It would have been this amazing, diverse mosaic. Sure, in places where resources were spread thin, think the middle of a huge continent, you would have absolutely found those small mobile groups from the old myth. But in places with a ton of food year-round, like the Florida coast or the Pacific Northwest with its salmon runs, you could have had large settled kingdoms, just like the Calusa. They'd have leaders, inequality, big building projects, all of it, without ever planting a seed. In this world, the environment, not the plow, would have been destiny.
And here's one final, wild twist. When you actually look at the skeletons, it turns out that early farmers weren't always healthier. In fact, hunter-gatherers were often taller, they had better teeth, and because they weren't all packed together, they were way less vulnerable to the big epidemics that ripped through the first cities. Turns out, what we call progress has always had its downsides.
So, maybe in the end, the real job of agriculture wasn't to invent complexity from scratch. Maybe it was just pouring gasoline on a fire that was already burning. It took the kinds of complex societies that could already exist in a few rich places and gave them a way to expand and cover the whole planet. Without it, we wouldn't be this one single global civilization. We'd be a world of many, many different worlds, each with its own unique answer to what it means to be human. And that is a pretty incredible world to imagine.